Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about VMC. We're going to describe what VMC is. We are going to talk about how it's derived by the manufacturer. We're going to talk about what affects VMC and how it affects us as pilots of multi-engine aircraft. First thing I want to do is read verbatim from CFR Part 23.149. Defines VMC as the calibrated airspeed at which, when the critical engine is suddenly inoperative, it's possible to maintain control of the airplane with that engine still inoperative and thereafter maintain straight flight at the same speed with an angle of bank of not more than 5 degrees. In summary, VMC is about directional control. You'll notice that VMC said nothing about maintaining altitude or anything else. It's about maintaining directional control of the aircraft. On our airspeed indicator, VMC is denoted by a red line. It's usually somewhere up in here. And to put it most simply, the VMC speed, or the minimum controllable airspeed, is really all about rudder authority. Let me bring my drawing in here. We talked last time about asymmetrical thrust, right? We talked about critical engines, so we understand those concepts. VMC is all about how effective our rudder is or is not. And while the book, the POH, publishes a definite VMC speed, the truth is VMC is a living, breathing animal. It changes with conditions. It changes with airplane configurations, weight, atmospheric events, all kinds of things. So we never truly know what the VMC speed is until we experience it, and then we can say, okay, under these conditions, that's VMC. But the manufacturers have done a pretty good job of identifying the worst case scenario for VMC determination. How do they do that? Again, they take all these flight conditions and say, okay, what's the worst possible thing that configuration we can be in, and let's work from there. It makes VMC the most conservative instead of the best case scenario, and we should be able to control the aircraft if we have any condition better than what they have established. So the first criteria, which this is all laid out in the 23.149, it talks about how to determine VMC. The first thing that we want to talk about is our center of gravity. All right. According to the CFRs, the center of gravity needs to be in the aft location. We talked about that last time. Why the aft, right? From our rudder to the CG is the shortest arm. When it's in the aft position, it's the weakest the rudder is going to be. It's also creates a stronger thrust vector, or a arm at this moment, remember from last time, on the descending blade of our good engine. The CG in the aft location will give us less directional control than if it was up here in the forward position, so it has to be at the rear of the CG limit. The next thing is the airplane needs to be trimmed for takeoff. And that's, I guess, in my opinion, that's just more of a setting up a standard configuration, because we could have all kinds of trim, anywhere from trim up to trim down, and rudder trim and aileron trim and all that. So the CFR just specifies trim in takeoff condition. Next, the airplane needs to be out of ground effect when we determine this VMC. Why is that? Well, if we think about it, ground effect provides that cushioning layer, right? That cushion of air that provides us a false sense of an ability to fly. And we've all experienced it in our single engine flying days. When you climb out of ground effect, you don't have the same climb performance as you do when you're in ground effect. So airplane needs to be out of ground effect. We want to be at maximum takeoff weight also. Why is that? Well, when we're at maximum takeoff weight, the airplane is developing the most lift, right? Also, the airplane is having its, I would say, most difficult performance, or it's not performing as well as if it was really light, right? Now, as I kind of mentioned, max weight can help us with VMC because a heavier airplane is developing more lift. You know, lift equals weight in the diagram here. So that can help us. However, performance-wise, it places more strain on the engines, and it will decrease our ability to maintain directional control. For VMC determination, we have to have maximum power on our operating engine. The operating engine, in case I didn't say it, needs to be the non-critical engine. In our case, in most cases, it's going to be the right engine operative, the left engine inoperative. That is the critical engine, and that's a worst case scenario. Next, flaps. Flaps are in takeoff position, both wing flaps back here, as well as our cow flaps on the engines themselves. So flaps, wing and cow in takeoff position. Landing gear, retracted. Why retracted? Well, the landing gear provides some stabilizing effect, kind of like a keel on a boat. We've got the landing gear, we've got the doors. It may provide some directional control, so we want to get rid of that and just use a clean aircraft. Next, standard atmospheric conditions. We want to be at sea level if possible, and standard temperature, standard pressure. So if you remember, we're looking at 2992 inches of mercury and 15 degrees Celsius. Why is that important? That's going to be the best conditions to provide maximum power by our operating engine. The higher we go in altitude, the higher we go in in temperature, the worse our engines are going to perform. Higher the density altitude, the less thrust vector we're going to have, the less turning moment we're going to have, and the better our rudder will be at directional control. Bank, we want to bank the engine up to 5 degrees. They allow us to bank it up to 5 degrees. Any more than that, and there's possibility, I should say, that we may have an advantage, I guess. So the manufacturers are limited to 5 degrees. Now, if you remember, as we bank, I'm going to go to this piece of paper here. As we bank an airplane, and let me add, we're banking into the operative engine. So the old mantra, raise the dead, right? So we have our multi-engine airplane. We have our dead engine, right? We have our operative engine providing thrust. We're allowed up to 5 degrees. Remember, lift in a perfectly flat or straight and level flight acts perpendicular. We have a 100% vertical component of lift. As we bank the aircraft, we now have not only a vertical component of lift, but we also have a horizontal component of lift. And this horizontal component of lift gives us a slight advantage. Well, it's more than slight. It provides a distinct advantage to rudder control and authority. So we're allowed up to 5 degrees into the operating engine. And finally, we for VMC determination for book values, the inoperative engine needs to be windmilling. Okay, so we're allowed, if it has auto feather capability, we're allowed to let it auto feather, but for most aircraft, it needs to be windmilling. All that does is it provides best case scenario here, worst case scenario here, maximum drag, maximum turning moment around this way, and whatever our airspeed is that we are still able to maintain directional control, that is our VMC speed, and that's what's published by the manufacturer. Now, that said, this value is static. It stays the same because the test conditions are sterile and the same every time. But we don't fly under these conditions at sea level, at maximum weight, or takeoff weight, and all that stuff, right? We fly in all different kinds of conditions, and so this VMC value is going to vary all around the spectrum here. Obviously, we want VMC as low as possible. That gives us the widest operating range. There may come a point where VMC is equal to our stall speed, which in that case we've got bigger worries because we are stalling and we need to regain some airspeed. So how do these different flight conditions affect VMC? Well, let's talk about the weight up here. So if we are at maximum weight, as I mentioned briefly before, maximum weight is going to provide maximum lift, right? If we have maximum lift, we have more opportunity for this horizontal component of lift. So our VMC would decrease with a heavier aircraft versus a lighter aircraft. It just makes sense. If we're extremely light with our weight, then our lift is going to be light also, and we don't have that spare lift, I guess you would say, to provide a large horizontal component of lift on the vertical stabilizer, on the rudder, to give it more authority. Gear up, I talked about that a little bit. The gear up versus down. Down, it could give us some advantage. So when we put the gear down, the trade-off though is that we create a lot of drag, right? And drag isn't good when we're in a single engine operation. When we have one engine inoperative, creating drag is the last thing we want to do. So generally, we want to keep the gear up. However, just realize that putting the gear down could lower VMC due to the directional stability factors that the gear may provide. Flaps up versus flaps down. Okay, if we put the flaps up, VMC is going to increase. Obviously, if we put the flaps down, VMC is decreasing. If you think about it, we have this thrust vector over here. We put flaps down on both sides because obviously we can't do just one side, right? I mean, if we could, that would be great. We would put down just the operative side and leave the inop side up, but we can't do that. So if you put the flaps down, we're creating drag. We're creating kind of like the gear extension before that I mentioned. We're creating a stabilizing effect. We're pulling this wing back this way by creating that induced drag. All right. CG, forward versus aft. Again, when we put the CG way forward, it's helping us out. It's decreasing VMC. It's making it this way, right? Why is that? Again, we have a long arm here, a lot of force, a lot of leverage. We have a short arm from the thrust vector here to here. Okay, so that is going to definitely help us. CG forward, lower VMC. Cowl flaps open and closed. Again, we're talking about drag and stabilizing effect. With the cowl flaps closed, the airplane is smoother. There's more opportunity for this thrust vector here to negatively impact the aircraft. Windmilling prop. On our critical engine, with this propeller windmilling, we are creating a ton of drag. What is that going to do? It's going to increase our VMC. We got a good engine pulling us around this way. We got a bad engine pulling us around this way. We've got whatever our arm is here for our center of gravity. If we have a prop that's windmilling, we are going to increase our VMC, or our minimum controllable airspeed. So this prop needs to be feathered. Standard temperature and pressure, we talked about that. It's a baseline, right? Anything less, any higher density altitude, let's say, is going to lower our VMC. And I mentioned that earlier. It's going to take the performance away from the operating engine. It's going to create less of a thrust vector, and which allows our rudder to keep up with directional control. Bank. All right, up to 5 degrees of bank. We talked about banking the aircraft, raising the dead engine, provides a horizontal component of lift on the rudder. Okay, this is a good time to have the side slip discussion. What we're going for is 0 side slip. And to do this, I'm going to attempt to draw. Wow, that's kind of bad. You probably know what that is, right? That's our inclinometer and our turn and bank indicator. With one engine operative, all right, with our critical engine out, one engine operative, if we center the ball right here, as we are normally accustomed to doing, we are going to fly with a side slip towards the inoperative engine. Okay, so the relative wind is coming like this, hitting the aircraft at its side. Now, I may be exaggerating this, but you get the idea. What does that do? For one, it creates a ton of drag. You think about it. When we're private, in our single engine private pilot days, we had to demonstrate a side slip, right? It was a great way to lose a lot of altitude, to get us down to the runway when we didn't have a lot of distance to the runway without gaining a bunch of airspeed. So why would we want to create all this drag and losing altitude when it's the exact opposite of what we want to be doing? Furthermore, this side slip further exacerbates our left turning tendency. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. The air is pushing on this side of the aircraft. It's pushing on the vertical stabilizer, and we're trying to rotate about the center of gravity. It also decreases the effectiveness of the rudder. So we've got this rudder over here. It's decreasing the angle of attack for the vertical stabilizer, masking the rudder in some way, shape, or form, and we're losing the ability for directional control. So we do not want to have the ball centered. What we want to have is the ball, I'll use a different color here, about a half to a third out of the cage. And that's achieved by banking the aircraft up to 5 degrees into the operating engine. That will set up a 0 side slip condition. The relative wind will be back straight on, as it should be, and we're going to reduce a whole bunch of drag. So that's really important to know and understand, especially if we are in instrument conditions or at night. You know, we can't really see maybe the ground track or what's going on. know and understand that we need to be up to 5 degrees into the operating engine and the ball in the inclinometer out of cage approximately 1/2. All right. Understand that, and we talked about it, in versus out of ground effect. If we are out of ground effect, we're going to have a higher VMC speed. All right. And again, it's just that cushion of air that we all know about. Let me see if I forgot anything. I do not think so. Just some interesting facts, I guess you would say. Figures. I'm going to look at my notes here real quick. On this drag, we want to delay our descent, obviously, right? Some light twin aircraft are able to maintain level flight on one engine. Most are not. We talked about losing 80 to 90% of our performance. We lose 50% of our thrust producing capability, but we lose a whole bunch of performance in all this induced drag from the aircraft. So, flaps. Putting flaps down can cause 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. All right, that much drag. That's what they're there for. So, flaps down is going to cause us some real grief. A windmilling prop, that one could be up to 400 to 500 feet per minute descent. If we don't feather this prop, we're looking at an automatic 500 foot per minute penalty when we're struggling trying to maintain altitude. Think about that if you're over hostile terrain. Gear extended, we're talking 150 foot per minute. All right, so if you add all these up, even best case scenario, that's 850 feet per minute loss simply by not cleaning up the airplane. Okay, so we want to make sure that as soon as this engine, our critical engine, goes dead, that we're cleaning up the airplane. And we're going to talk about how to respond and what actions a pilot needs to take in the next video, because I don't want to make this one too long. But know and understand that we need to start thinking about this right away. If our aircraft is not certified for sustained level flight on one engine, then we need to start immediately thinking about our best glide speeds and cleaning up the airplane and letting this engine do its job best it can. Hope that helped. Any questions, leave me a comment, send me an email, do whatever. That covers VMC.